Hello and welcome to this video where I'll be talking about what we mean when we think about responsible research assessment. I'm Rachel Herbert, a Senior Research Evaluation Manager and an Associate of the International Centre for the Study of Research at Elsevier. The mission of ICSR is to further the study of research and thus to contribute to the evidence base supporting the practice of research strategy, evaluation and policy. I'm going to talk about research assessment in the broader context of research evaluation, so you'll hear me using both terms interchangeably to some extent. So let's explore those terms first. Research evaluation can broadly be defined as the systems and approaches in which any research stakeholder evaluates or assesses the performance of any other research stakeholder. So that can include formal or informal evidence, frameworks, behaviours, narrative evidence of societal impact, evidence of influence, reputation, and so many other aspects. Research evaluation can be used retrospectively to look at past performance. Having said that, it's increasingly being used as a forwards-looking approach, considering and weighing up strategic objectives or resources for the future. So we should make a clear distinction between research evaluation and research metrics, acknowledging and here focusing on the overlap, because we want to think about the responsible use of research metrics in research evaluation. Research metrics might include scientometric, bibliometric, or altmetric indicators and rankings based on these. Critically though, not all evaluation uses metrics, and not all metrics are useful for evaluation. As the diagram here suggests, there are times when research evaluation can be conducted without recourse to research metrics, and conversely, not all research metrics are useful in a research evaluation context. So responsible research assessment really became more important, I would say, over the last 10 to 15 years. And let's think about a music analogy to consider why. Here we suggest a drumbeat of change where the amplitude and frequency is rising, not necessarily steadily, but overall, and we're getting a louder, higher pitched tone. This general trend is seemingly being driven by increased competition for scarce resources such as funding and faculty positions, and increased accountability from funders and government policies, especially during the pandemic. We also see a huge increase in the scrutiny of research infrastructure and culture and practices such as open science, not only from funders but also the public. So I'll now draw your attention to a few events that have driven this drumbeat over the years. We start in 2013 when DORA, the Declaration on Research Assessment, was published. 2 years later, the Leiden Manifesto came out, followed a few months later by a report from the UK called the Metric Tide. Most recently, the Hong Kong Principles were published in 2020. So the research community has been actively trying to make changes for quite some time. We'll look into these statements in more detail in just a moment. Like many organisations, Elsevier has contributed to the drumbeat too. We've supported and endorsed some of the statements I just mentioned. We've launched the group that I'm a part of, the International Centre for the Study of Research, and we've had plenty of developments among our offerings that speak to the need for better research assessment. And finally here, I want to talk about the drivers of these activities. Firstly, a desire for better bibliometric indicators. That is, indicators connected to publications and the linked citations. The community wants these to be smarter and more appropriate for use. Secondly, a desire for non-bibliometric indicators to provide a broader view of research. These go beyond citations and consider societal impact or how an individual researcher has contributed in a holistic sense. Thirdly, an increasing focus by funders, governments and the public to get a clear picture of the societal and economic outcomes of research in a truly global sense. Fourthly, and very complementary to the third point, there's an increasing focus on institutional or university missions and how they are impacting local communities. The fifth driver is open research and evaluation infrastructure. More on that in a moment. The open science agenda is really closely interlinked with the improvements in research evaluation over the last 10 years. And finally, the last driver here is about the need to change research culture globally, especially in connection to inclusion and diversity and sustainability. As I mentioned, open science is closely connected to research evaluation. In the diagram on the left here, you'll see a house of sorts. Open science is the roof of the building. It's a broad, overarching term under which sits a lot of initiatives. In the basement, we have the open tools and software which are underpinning those same initiatives. And those include open access, open data, and open metrics. And those three almost immediately pull you into ideas around research integrity and reproducibility, and science and society. Now let's go back to the statements that I mentioned in connection to the rising desire for responsible research assessment, and let's consider what they say. While there are some specific emphases from each of the statements, happily, there is quite some overlap in the sentiment and even in the language at times. All agree that the research community should use explicit evaluation criteria and a variety of metrics or indicators to support expert review. All call for us to recognise the limitations of publication-based metrics and extend our assessment approaches to include non-publication indicators. And all strive for openness of data and transparency around the calculation of metrics. Now to those specific emphases. DORA additionally promotes best practice in authorship, citation practices, and research evaluation. The Leiden Manifesto pushes trust by involving those being evaluated and recommends avoiding false precision. The Metric Tide suggests pursuing improved research data infrastructure, and the Hong Kong principles look to ensure that researchers are recognised and rewarded for behaviours that strengthen research integrity. Let's look at what they don't say as well. The statements themselves are anti-reductionist, yet they've been reduced in some reporting to being, say, anti-journal impact factor or anti-H index. But actually, not one of the statements recommends a ban of the existing research metrics. Rather, they recommend the end of their inappropriate use. Similarly, none of them call for a ban on the creation of new research metrics, only that they be designed according to best practices. And none claim that metrics themselves are responsible or not. They're just numbers after all. Only that responsibility rests in those that use them. So these statements give us some guiding principles, but let's look at those recommendations in action. I'll use a few examples here from around Elsevier for this purpose. We've supported and encouraged the responsible use of metrics and responsible research, evaluation and assessment for many years, but are always thinking about how we can support or facilitate this more, so we try to constantly evolve. In one of our platforms, SciVal, but also available at any time via a quick Google search or the link here, you can find our Research Metrics Guidebook. It covers all the metrics that are featured in that platform, SciVal, and many might be familiar to you already, so it's a useful and free resource whether you're using SciVal or not. Included in the guidebook, we actually devote a whole chapter where we suggest the metrics to use given the evaluation situation you're presented with, and we even give some suggestions of ancillary or companion metrics that you could use, thereby reinforcing the idea that you should never rely on just one metric. You should always have a mix of both qualitative and quantitative metrics and indicators for truly responsible research. This information is also handily available if you're using SciVal too. In fact, it'll pop right up in the platform, so you can always get that extra bit of guidance if you need it. Let's talk about journal metrics. You may consider these when you're submitting a manuscript, for example. Journal metrics are constantly under scrutiny. It's important that they be used to indicate the performance of the entire entity that is the journal, but not the individual authors that publish papers in it. Elsevier's journal-based citation indicator is called CiteScore. It's intended to provide the average rate of citations in a given journal over a given period of time. It was launched in 2016, and after much research and reflection on expert and user feedback, we actually revised it in 2020. That links back to Principle 10 of the Leiden Manifesto to scrutinise indicators. The methodology is simple and easy to understand. That links to Principle 4 in the Leiden Manifesto, making data collection and analytical processes open and simple and easy to understand. The underlying data are freely available for verification purposes. No subscription to the Scopus needed. That covers Principle 5 of the Leiden Manifesto. We rounded the values to just one decimal place after a lot of testing. That covers Leiden Manifesto Principle 8, where they recommend avoiding misplaced concreteness or false precision. And to include Principle 9, which is about recognising systematic effects, we present CiteScore as a suite of indicators and alongside two other journal citation metrics. So that was journal metrics. Now let's consider author metrics. Here we're looking at a screenshot of Scopus and an author profile. You'll see all the metrics and indicators are based on the author's publication that are captured in the Scopus database. Again, let's walk through how we're taking a responsible research assessment approach to presenting this information. Principle 4 of the Leiden Manifesto recommends keeping data simple and transparent, and here we show you exactly how we got to what we present. And if this author wants to check the data and analysis on her profile, she has the ability to do so, because she can check whether we have all of the correct publications matched to her name. Principle 7 asks us to base assessment of researchers on a qualitative judgment of their portfolio. So you see, we don't just display numbers, but also include terms or words that depict the topics this author is connected to via her publications, thereby highlighting her research expertise. We talked a moment ago about avoiding misplaced concreteness or false precision, Again, here, we take that into consideration, providing supporting graphs that tell a much fuller story. And lastly, we recognize the systematic effects and that a suite of indicators is always preferred. We recognize the rise of preprint servers and their importance in scholarly communications by presenting those papers here. So it's worth noting that this is what you get when you start to see a more responsible approach to researcher assessment. Several indicators, sure, but also qualitative data, charts, and links to the underlying data. It does take more time to process than a single H-index on a page, for example, but I hope you'll agree that you could end up with a much better understanding of who the researcher is. If you want to understand and learn more about this topic, please see the links on this page. There's a much longer video that you can watch from a colleague, Stephanie Faulkner, and there are some other useful resources here too. I hope you found this a useful resource, and thank you very much for your time.